can teach.
I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Today I'm excited to be speaking with Jesper Juul, whose book, The Art of Failure, an essay on the pain of playing video games, is just a really great read. Some people are fans of video games, some people may not be, but I think we can all agree that the idea is to have fun, and that's mostly why we play video games, or at least that seems to be. What Jesper talks about in this book is that we're actually constantly failing in video games, and in fact, if there was a video game in which we didn't fail, we're virtually guaranteed not to like it. And so it's this counterintuitive idea that can be applied to much more than video games, I think, but it's a wonderful starting point. He's been doing amazing work in video games, and I'm really fortunate to be speaking to him today. So thank you, Jesper, for talking to me today. How did you start to think of video games in relation to failure, and where did this essay on the pain of playing video games come from?
Well, I think in a way it is a bit what it says on the tin, right? That I was wondering about these questions of, you might say, video game aesthetics, and so this can both be something we think about in a kind of general sense, like what are the aesthetics of video games, or we can think about the types of emotions that video games kind of give us. And then it was interesting to think about how video games, at least when they're kind of promoted, is often described as being fun. And it's even some of the game design literature kind of acknowledges that a kind of fun is a very shallow word and tries to kind of break it up, but still fun is a kind of word that keeps kind of recurring. But then it was funny to me, or funny or unfunny to me, that video games have this thing inside them, which is that we fail a lot. And I think this is both something you can see when you watch people play, that there's something about the word fun that at least doesn't seem to kind of cover all the possible kinds of experiences or engagements we have with video games. And also, it was something I kind of, as I talk about in the book, I experienced quite personally. I am, and this is completely true, I'm a pretty sore loser, so I get very upset when I fail in video games, and you could say that in a way it's this kind of thing. Like I also understand that in a way it's something that you're not supposed to be a sore loser for many different reasons, right? Well, you're supposed to win games, that's one of them, but also you're not supposed to be kind of too upset either by, I guess, the challenges that life gives you in general, or specifically about losing or failing in video games. And to me, it was just sort of like a weird thing, like how can this thing that we talk about as fun have these emotions and experiences inside them that are very kind of non-fun. And if you look at how video games are designed, it's also pretty clear that you design for failure. That's a lot of video game design, is figuring out how failure should work, and failure is something that kind of pushes people forward. And to me, that was just sort of like such a very large, weird complex of things. And then I just spent some time trying to figure out how to think about it. And then I realized that there is this whole kind of philosophical tradition about the paradox of tragedy, about people watching theater or horror cinema, and actually seeking out emotions that seem to be emotions that we don't normally want to seek out. So people seem to behave in quite weird or paradoxical ways in relation to some art forms, such as video games. And that's kind of what the project came from.
You highlight a number of really interesting things, but the paradox of failure, for anyone who hasn't read, you say that basically there's these 3 points, and they don't all seem to make sense when you put them together. 1, we generally avoid failure. All of these seem to make sense, right? 2, we experience failure when playing games. And 3, we seek out games, although we know that we're going to experience some failure.
Yeah.
Is that different then? Can you say a little bit in relation to horror, when we know we don't like being scared, but we go to horror movies to be scared? Or we don't like seeing death or tragedy, but we go to Shakespeare or whomever to experience those sad emotions? Do those fall into the same paradox, or is that somewhat different?
I mean, so these have been framed differently in theoretical terms, I build on this philosopher Aaron Smuts, who describes the general paradox of painful art, where I think I'd argue that yes, horror and tragic theater and games fall into the same kind of category, or it has the same kind of structure of the paradox, like that there's something we generally avoid. We experience this in the art form of whatever art form we're talking about. And so it seems out we seek in certain kinds of art experiences that we normally avoid. And so I think that's very similar. Of course, there are, you can say when you get down to it, there are also kind of differences. You might say that in a way, video games, of course, kind of have this kind of promise that it's possible to evade failure, even though, of course, we know this is not something that we do kind of practically. And there's also a sense of responsibility in general in video games that's kind of different than from, say, like any kind of narrative format, in that if you watch a tragic play, whatever happens is very much not your responsibility, right? But whereas if you fail in a video game, it is set up such that it is your responsibility, right? You could just have played better. So there's something quite different in that sense, right? That in a way, which is also what I talked about in my previous work, that kind of narrative art forms are really about the representation of events of others, or of fictional characters or non-fictional characters. But a large part of video games, or games in general, is actually about you, right? So it's just, if you play an abstract game, if you play like football and you lose, it's just an empirical social fact, right? It's not a fictional representation of anything. It's just is, right? And so that means also that some of the kind of negative emotions you might experience failing in a video game or a game are just kind of quite regular, right? So there is a difference in that sense, like that there's a frame of reference in video games can in a way kind of seem very kind of ordinary or quotidian, right? It's just you do something and you fail at it, whereas other art forms are actually about kind of watching someone else or reading about someone else kind of struggling with their personal limitations, and video games or games are about your personal limitations. So in that sense, it's different, that games are in a way a bit more kind of personal in the way the negative emotions are produced.
And you've sort of alluded to this borrowing from other disciplines, because studying video games is relatively new in cultural studies and related areas. What I've noticed, at least in reading on video games, is that there's two main fields or previous concepts, I guess, that people borrow from. One being literature, the other being games in terms of sports. How do you find taking these ideas, and what do you have to change when you do think about video games? So, as you said, in literature, it's not your fault that Hamlet dies. So you experience potential sadness, but not because of what you've done. And then in sports, of course, if you lose a football match or something, it is your fault, but you tend not to take it so seriously as the death of a main character or something like that. So there seems to be trade-offs. What have you noticed in terms of adopting certain ideas, and are there other fields or other areas that you've looked into?
Oh yeah, this is a big question. I guess I remember when I just started out as a kind of very young PhD, I had this idea that would be certain kinds of problems where I could just look to another field and then I would get it solved. And I remember looking at what we call the question of emergence in games, the fact that many games, and we typically talk about chess or Go, have very simple rules, but the actual playing of the game is very complex. And this is what we call emergence, right? That you have some simple structures can generate complexity. And I thought, all right, I'll just read it up. And I kind of tried to go to kind of physics and like the sciences of complexity and read up on emergence. And it just turned out everybody completely disagreed about what it meant. And so I think in general, kind of borrowing from other fields is usually a lot more time intensive than you would hope. But I also think it's just usually super interesting, right? But as long as you just prepare yourself for the work that people are not really going to agree in the field that you're trying to import or borrow from, and B, that a lot of what becomes interesting is actually also how it reflects back to, say, like literary theory, if you're trying to apply literary theory to games, like to to look at the kind of shortcomings, or like what is it that isn't described very well if you apply literary theory to games, or what is it that seems to be missing. It's very intellectually satisfying to do these things, but it just takes some time and some reading. And I think perhaps like for game studies, like we talked about sports and literary theory. I mean, there was also something I think where we were trying to import a bit from, you might say, like the professional discourse around game design. So people were writing books on game design and trying to think about like what would that mean? What would that be like if it was more kind of systematic, or if the terms were better defined? And one of the kind of adjacent fields to that was something like kind of computer science, where the kind of the study of systems, and I also talked about the sciences of complexity. And so these were things that weren't really kind of attuned to being applied to something that's aesthetic or about experience. But I guess that in itself was just interesting to try to think about, if you take a kind of complicated systems concept like that of emergence, like how do you actually apply this to something which is about experience? I would say just in general, like when I work, I often do something like what I did in this book, right? That I take something which might take the form of a paradox, or something that just is weird, or where it doesn't seem like we have very good language for talking about it, and then I just kind of read a lot, and then I look at all kinds of weird fields, and then to find a kind of frame in which I think the kind of question becomes clearer, and there might be that I see a way of talking about whatever it is I'm looking at. And so this is also what I did here, right? So I looked at a number of different things, and I kind of found or kind of converged with myself on this kind of the paradox of painful art and the paradox of tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack in that, because I think that's something pretty much any scholar is doing, is reading or thinking about one thing and looking elsewhere to see what's available, and then seeing what fits and what doesn't. And so I do want to talk a little bit more about that, but I want to ask, I guess, when it comes to failure, you mentioned sort of in the book that any game in which you don't fail is not a very satisfying game.
Yeah.
But there's also, I guess, a game that's impossible, or a game that is ridiculously difficult is not also satisfying, although I guess maybe different people have different thresholds. You have this example of a button where it says something like, push this button to win this game.
Yeah.
I love that example because it so clearly illustrates how, a simple, easy game like that, people say often that they want things to be simple or easy, but if you actually made it as simple and easy as push this button to win this game, no one would be satisfied. And I got to say, I appreciate it also because I was looking at this, and then I was going into one of my classes where people were complaining that, the work was too hard, basically. I'm sure no other professor's ever heard that from students. But they were saying that this final research project was, too difficult, too many sources and stuff like that. So I showed them this image, and I said, if you could push this button and be done and just get a B or an A or something on this final capstone, this year-long thing that my students are doing, would you be happy? And within a minute or two, they realized that, we actually do appreciate some of this hard work, because then we feel like we've achieved something. Is there some kind of way, I'm sorry for that sort of long-winded way of getting to this, but
yeah, sure.
Is there some kind of way of thinking about the threshold or the limit to this? Because if you have a button that is push this to win game, nobody's satisfied. But also if you have a very, very difficult thing that involves something that involves a lot of intensive labor, people are also not happy. Is there any way to think about this, about the sweet spot, or however you want to frame this?
Yeah, so in the book I borrow a bit from what's called attribution theory in psychology, which in a way the basic question is about, if something happens, why do you think it happened, right? And so to what do you attribute the event? And so the kind of simple question is like, if we are in a room together and there's a glass of water on the table, and the glass of water is knocked down, say by me, do I then attribute that event to say me being clumsy, or perhaps like the table being wobbly, or do I attribute it to, say, you having placed the glass so close to the edge, right? And so that in a way is the kind of interesting question, and there is some stuff that's interesting from kind of learning sciences about what does it take for people to feel helpless in a situation? And so it's often, you might, if you think of it in terms of the effect, so what we call learned helplessness is this feeling that nothing we do will make any difference. And so you can say, for in the negative sense, like for a game that's kind of too hard, like what is it that makes you feel that nothing you do will make any difference? And so it's often perhaps like if the situation feels like is similar like every single time. So in a way, this is why a lot of popular games, say Candy Crush, tend to randomize the level. So you get this feeling that there might be some other way or something else could happen sometime in the future that would allow you to solve the problem. There's also a social aspect to it, right? That if you know that everybody is struggling with a particular problem, you don't feel as bad. So if you know everybody else is doing better than you, then it's a big problem. So you see, I think I might say just we use all these kind of indicators to figure out whether something is okay, right? And or whether it's whether we think that we can actually get better or we can progress. And so this is why, of course, sometimes, as you're saying, sometimes it's a good idea to preface a hard assignment with saying that this is really hard, but that's part of the point. Or I guess it's also become popular for teaching, say, like first generation academic students, explaining to them that in a way, actually, if you study, it's pretty common to have periods of time where you don't feel like you know why you're there, what you're doing. Just to explain that these kind of situations are really kind of common, and it's not something that's kind of wrong with you, right? So I think it's just more a question that there are a number of indicators we use to figure out whether we kind of feel stuck or whether we can go further. And this is also why you can have incredibly difficult games. Like, well, people will talk about a game like Dark Souls. I mentioned this other game called Quap, which in a way is a sports game by Bennett Foddy, but where it turns out to be, you think you're about to run a 100-meter dash, but it turns out to be actually very difficult to even walk. So you end up just like falling over immediately. That game was really popular on YouTube, right? So people got to it by seeing other people like kind of shouting about how difficult it was. And that in turn meant that if people picked it up, they didn't feel bad about not being able to play any better than they did, right? Because they knew it was normal to fail. So in a way, there's this whole kind of social side to it. And then there's this other side where people will, or games will often say something like thanks for playing, please try again, or you might have something like multiple indicators of success, right? So this whole thing about achievements. So even though you're not succeeding with your main goal, there might be this other thing, like you picked up 15 units of blah, 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 right? So the game is always like telling you that there is some kind of progress, even if it's not the main progress. And that makes you feel less stuck than you would otherwise. On the other end of that spectrum, like games that are too easy, I mean, one of the things that you say that failure does, and this is kind of well documented, is that if you succeed at something, you don't have any reason to reconsider what you did. And this means that if you have a game that's too easy, what happens is also that you don't actually get to kind of reflect on what you were doing. And so it also means that it's very hard to actually learn anything in terms of playing if the game is too easy. So failure often kind of pushes you towards kind of reconsidering your strategy. So it's a way for you to realize that you did something wrong and then to do some interesting thinking about what you should do better. And then it's a kind of measuring point for realizing that you have become better. So if you don't fail at first, you don't necessarily kind of feel or realize that you have improved. So that is also a problem on the other end.
It seems to make so much sense then, based on what you've said, that a lot of other areas are adopting this kind of gamification with, I don't know if it's just me, but I feel like earlier on in game studies, people were talking about gamification and it had relatively positive connotations. Now it feels like it has really negative connotations, I think mostly because it's been adapted by businesses at, say, call centers or what have you, where people are really doing inherently boring, unsatisfying things, but the companies are trying to gamify it. So saying, you kept this customer, you get 50 points or whatever. And this seems like, I don't know, perhaps a bastardization of the original ideas of game studies or gamification,
Hmm.
do you see areas where gamification and these kinds of concepts are not applicable or should not be applicable? Or I guess I'm asking you in general to weigh in on this whole idea of gamification and its seemingly unending interest in that, particularly from those trying to collect as much capital or capitalize on this system.
Yeah, it's funny when you put it like that. You can say that in a way. I mean, this is a criticism of say like kind of social media or YouTube these days that that like we have all been gamified by an algorithm, right? That just tries to maximize our interaction in different ways. And you could say the issue with gamification can be a bit similar to that, right? You might say the YouTube algorithm has a different goal than we have, right? So we have a goal which is about kind of living our life and perhaps consuming interesting media content. And the YouTube algorithm has a goal of just like making us watch as much YouTube as possible.
Yeah.
Right? So there's a non-alignment there. And I think you can say in general that's a problem with kind of unsuccessful gamification as well. There's this what they call like the measurement problem. If you're trying to measure how well people are doing at anything, often there is a kind of mismatch, right? So the measurement is really precise. So right, so if you're like an academic, so somebody might get the idea that you can measure an academic by how many publications they make, and then this is not exactly aligned with what it is to be a good researcher.
Yeah.
So you could often do many more publications if you just like publish things that are more similar or lowered your standards a bit, and so that's not really kind of productive. And you take gamification in a way it's just a way where all of that is kind of framed in a positive sense, like that this idea that it is enjoyable in itself to get some kind of points or some kind of feedback. And I think it's kind of complicated, and there's also a lot of kind of psychological studies on it. So I think one thing that's to me is pretty central is that I think it works best if it is up to the user or end user or person to figure out what the point or the gamification actually means. It's not so useful if, say, like you measured on how many papers you publish, and then it ends up in someone's Excel sheet, so sort of higher up, and they look like, why did you publish more papers this year? And you might have been writing a book or something like that. So in that case, it's not very useful, right? And might be completely counterproductive. In the case where it's more like you realize, I actually didn't write so many papers this year. Why was that? And then you might realize that perhaps you spent too much time, I don't know, like reading. You should have just started writing, because you actually you knew already what the paper was supposed to be about, right? You pushed it off by reading too much. So that case, it's useful. So a lot of it hinges on like how whatever output comes from a gamification system, how it's actually used. I think also we should realize that a lot of this stuff has already kind of been discussed in a way. So grades are actually a kind of gamification already. Are grades kind of motivating, or are they demotivating? Is there such a thing as teaching to the test, which there is? Like, what happens if people just focus on the grade rather than on the learning to which the grade was just supposed to be a proxy, and so on? So the way a lot of these discussions have already happened, gamification is just very kind of similar to that in a way.
I guess I'd like to follow up with that, considering the idea of manipulation and how much gamification or just games in general are able to set up a feeling of autonomy. For example, I was really interested in this game that you mentioned in the book that I'd never heard of. Is it called the Suicide Game? Is that what it is?
Yeah.
Yeah. So setting something up like that, where it clearly plays with conventions, because in order to win this game, you get your character to drink poison or to commit suicide. And in order to do that, it seems counterproductive, because you're hurting yourself as the character, but you also want to do that. And then you mention other aspects of that game, for example, that it's very cartoonish, so it's less realistic, and there are other dimensions as well. But it seems like that setup would have little to no autonomy for the player. And so to argue that the player has then, as the protagonist, committed suicide doesn't seem as convincing as if you had an open sandbox type game and then the player decides to do one thing and not another. I'm curious how you see games and this idea of autonomy, considering the fact that these environments and pretty much the goals, for the most part, are created by somebody who is, to some extent, manipulating the player.
Yeah, so I think perhaps that there probably is a difference between games and kind of your regular work in that sense, in that at least to some extent choosing a game is voluntary, right? But if your boss imposes a point system upon you, that's probably not voluntary. So in that sense, it is different, right? And you might talk about it perhaps somewhat as a different kind of paradox, right? That you're sometimes voluntarily choosing to engage in an activity which has a lot of involuntary aspects to it, right? Because there is often a kind of goal structure that forces you to do certain things, or at least to work in certain directions. But I would say I think that there is a pretty large spectrum, right? So what I call games of progression, so typically adventure games or to some extent role-playing games, are often based around this kind of very strict sense of string of pearls. So you do A, and then you solve problem B, then you solve problem C, and you can't really do anything else. Yeah, so what I call like games of emergence, including the open world games, as you say, but also I would say like strategy games or even kind of board games are games where there might be one problem to solve, but you can solve it in like a very large range of ways. And so this means that often people feel, especially I think in good games in general, you feel autonomy from having solved a problem in the way you solve problems. So that there is this can be a kind of sense of personal expression in the way you solve a problem. And so if a game is sufficiently open, so you can still have like autonomy within a system that in a way is kind of predefined, right? If the system is kind of complex enough, so that's not a thing. But then I guess in addition, there probably is something with games sometimes, right? That it can be nice in certain games to just submit to the system. Mm-hmm. That it can be some kind of pleasure in just doing what the game tells you, at least for like a short period of time. So that is also, I think, a thing that can be a source of enjoyment or a type of experience in games as well. So you autonomously choose having little autonomy for a period of time.
And I think that goes back to some of the arguments about watching a tragedy, for example, right? Like you submit to that knowing that you're not able to change Hamlet's future, but you enjoy it nevertheless because you're submitting for, an hour and a half or whatever film or study or whatever you're spending time on. You have let the person, the director, whomever, take over that. In that sense, I mean, to what extent, I guess, do games allow for people to create things? Like, as you said, there can be an emergence when there's multiple possibilities. Does that make that game different than that theater-going experience? Or are they part of a sort of spectrum, would you say?
I think games are, in general, quite different, right? For at least the fact of that kind of participation. So this is like a discussion I think we used to always get into, right? So we said that games are interactive, as we used to say. Then somebody would say, well, actually, the movie audience is also actively interpreting the movie and so on. But of course, it is also quite different in that was it what I talked about before, just that as a player, you are kind of being evaluated on your own performance. And then also in terms of what's happening in the fictional content of a game, that whatever happens, there's some sense that you're responsible for someone dying or for failures. And a designer called Brenda Romero talks about this thing that games are the only art form where you can feel kind of regret, and that for having done something, or that you can often feel kind of complicit in games in a way that's kind of hard to do in other art forms. So if somebody dies in the game because of your actions, in a way there's a sense of responsibility. And a lot of newer games try to deal with this quite directly. So there's the Walking Dead series from Telltale, which involves a lot of these kind of Walking Dead-like kind of situations where you have to decide, like, who do you save? Do you save like the romantic interest or the child? and those are like very, very hard questions. And then no matter in a way what happens in the game afterwards, you will still always be someone, not just a character, but also a real person who who made that horrible decision of saving the child or saving the romantic interest, even though it was just in a game. That is something I think is very specific, right? So it's funny because this was like the kind of criticism that people always had of games, that, oh, in games you do all these horrible things. And then it turns out you can actually flip that on its head and say, well, actually, so the interesting thing about games is that in other art forms, you just sort of watch all these horrible things happen and you just pretend that you're kind of not enjoying them. Perhaps you are, we don't know. But in games, you actually have to face the fact that you made bad things happen, even if it's just in fictional form. So games are, in a way, a very, very kind of strong form for exploring things like responsibility and ethics.
Yeah, to follow up on that, there's this line that I really like in the book where you say, I would like to excise from the English language the phrase just a game because it pretends something that is not true, that failure is neutral as long as it happens in a game. And so I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how perhaps games and reality or lived experience link or can be separated. I also thought it was interesting because when I read that, I was thinking, I've also heard many times, it's just a movie. Don't worry, it's just a movie. And so is saying it's just a game different than just a movie or not? I'm curious, however you want to start to approach that, but go ahead.
Well, it's a movie question. It's similar, but it's also slightly different, right? So it is that question, like what happens if you react emotionally to an experience is obviously fictional, so like a movie, and then when you say like, oh, don't worry, it's just a movie, of course it's often about somebody having like a very strong emotional reaction, and it is this kind of, it's also kind of, that's in a whole other kind of philosophical discussion why we have these emotional reactions. I think games, again, they can have a fictional layer, but they also have this, what I call like the real the real aspect, but just the fact that a game is an artifact that kind of works in the world. You're doing something kind of socially. You are being judged on your performance. If you're winning or you're losing, that's an actual event. It's not a fictional event. So that makes it slightly different. So it's not about like how you judge something that happens in a fictional world. It's how you judge something that happens in the non-fictional world and what status you assign to it. So which is slightly different, right? In a way, one of the things I do in the book is just go through different kind of iterations or different angles on that question. Like, what does game failure mean? And you might say that when the people say, don't worry, it's just a game, that in a way is a kind of philosophy of game failure, right? So it's saying that because it's in a game, it has no kind of meaning outside the game. It's not something you should be upset about. Of course, it's, again, perhaps with the movie situation, it's something you say to people who are kind of demonstrably upset. You're saying that they shouldn't be. But just that then I'm going through these philosophical arguments about kind of what you might say, what is there something particular about failure in a game? Is it just such that because it's in a game, it has no value? Or is it just that, in a way, if you play a game, it's just any regular old other failure? And some of that becomes a question of both kind of the social situation, right? So if you grow up in a family where everybody agrees that any intelligent person can play chess on a very high level, and then you're terrible at playing chess, that's a kind of very real kind of social problem, right? But if you are in a situation where nobody cares about playing chess, then it matters much less. The value of failure or the meaning of failure often hinges on in a way to what extent you align performing well in the game with like your identity or with the social situation. And so as someone who writes a lot, for example, I feel I should be very good at kind of strategy games. But for reasons I don't know, I'm actually better at shooters. And that to me is a weird thing, right? So it always like hurts me when I perform badly in strategy games because my identity is as someone who's kind of intellectual. So that in a way is like failure, the meaning of failure, the question of like, is failure in a game just irrelevant or is it just like regular failure? That hinges just a lot on these kind of questions of like, what you think is important, who do you think you are, how you're being evaluated socially. So in a way that, and this is also to me what's interesting. You might have a kind of fairly abstract structure, like an abstract game or abstract board game or a card game, and then actually it turns out it pulls in all of these other things about like who you are, what your personal goals are, how you see yourself, how other people see you, what's valuable for the people you associate with.
That actually, it reminds me of certain games. Like I recently played Prey. Have you played that? Do you know that game?
I know of it. I haven't played it.
Yeah, well, it reminded me also of BioShock, and there are a number of games where you can opt to play one way that's arguably the less ethical way, and then you can opt to play another way that's the sort of good way, but it's also maybe more challenging, or there's some kind of reward system that in one way you're rewarded because you get more points or ammo or whatever, but in another way near the end of the game would punish you in the way that they're like, you've chosen these bad things, and so here's some kind of judgment of you. And so it does seem to reflect on you to a certain extent. I'm just curious if you could say more about the idea of fiction, because so let's say you're playing this game, well, like Grand Theft Auto 5, for example. There's one scene that always sticks out to me of torture where you're forced effectively to pull out teeth to torture this person, right? And you're doing it like you're pressing the X button as fast as you can, or whatever the case is. And so, yes, you're doing it, but you can't see what happens in the game unless this torture scene is completed. And I don't think anyone would say, like, I like torture and that's why I'm playing this or something. I hope not. Is that different as a fictional world than, say, seeing or watching American Psycho and seeing Patrick Bateman torture somebody? Is there a fundamental difference philosophically, ethically, or, because you're pressing that button in order for the torture to happen as opposed to simply watching it, is there something inherently different about those two fictional worlds?
No, it's a very complicated question. So I sometimes go to philosophical seminars where there are these long discussions about whether video game objects are real or not, and whether fictional video game actions are real or not. I think perhaps for something like this, that there is something. I think we probably have an intuition that there is something that's different, right? That there's some way in which you caused it to happen. Something bad in the fictional world, such as a torture scene, and that feels different. And I agree that is true. I think you can answer it on that level, right? I talked about this idea of complicity, that there is this feeling of complicity in making something like that happen. And then there's some interesting bits about that, which is that this can be structured in many different ways. When you talk about it in the GTA 5 torture scene, it's very hard you can't really avoid it if you want to play the game through. So there is an element of coercion from the game in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's slightly different if you have a game where it's a choice you make. And so, like one of my former colleagues, Michael Sicard, he has this argument about the Grand Theft Auto series actually being a kind of ethical series, because a lot of the time, especially if you're playing in the freeform mode, it gives you choices, right? So it allows you to actually kind of consider the ethics of what you're doing. And if you have something that's kind of linear, that's much less the case. So I think a lot of it comes down to the way the game is set up, and that makes makes it feel very different. Or if you have an option to do something kind of bad in the world versus not doing it, or whether you're somewhat coerced. So all of these kind of give us kind of slightly different tint to that kind of question.
So someone who wants to think of themselves, like me, for example, wants to think of myself as a good person.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you believe that games can teach ethical thinking or ethical dilemmas, or reflect it, because if I'm going to play, let's say I have the option, and so we're not talking about a linear progression, but I have an option to be killing people or not killing people as I play some kind of freeform game. And so does choosing the killing the people, which is, ethically wrong in the game world, let's say, as well as in the real world, does that translate somehow into one's ethical stance? Doing bad things in a game is not the same, but do you think that can indicate or teach people ethical lessons or ideas, or can we completely separate that?
And you can say, I think it's very hard to answer these very general kind of media effects kind of questions, right? And also they usually turn out to be not so linear as you might expect, right? So I think it might at least say on some level, I think kind of games do teach a number of things. So one of the things for failure, it is interesting how playing games kind of teaches you to deal with, say, failure in general. So it is, and of course, games are very much structured around this, setting you up for some kind of task, then kind of making you fail, forcing you to reflect on what you did wrong, kind of reconvening, restructuring your strategy, coming back, and so on. And that does seem to be a general skill that games teach. It seems, right, and you might say similarly. It seems, at least when you're faced with some kind of ethical dilemma or choice like that in a game, at least it kind of forces the activation of whatever faculties you might have for processing these things. I like video games a lot, but I'm also a bit reluctant to make these kind of claims about how they are so kind of healthy for you, or how they solve the world's problems. I think it's often a little more complicated like that. I mean, you might of course, like, make arguments like this, saying like, hey, if you have taught painting, obviously you could never do any harm, and that turns out not to be the case. I just think those are. I'm reluctant to answer questions in that way.
Yeah, no, and I can definitely appreciate that, because of course, anytime you simplify to say, games are good or games are bad, you're just setting yourself up to be contradicted, or to not really add much to the debate.
Right. So you say that, I mean, one of the reasons why we have something like game studies is, of course, that a number of people thought that video games, or games in general, just very clearly are a pretty large part of contemporary culture, and also kind of human culture in general, and we wanted to kind of think about them. And then, because video games have often been kind of described, when people had media panics about video games rather than social media as today, then it was often about, like, kind of assigning a very negative value to video games. And then, as a researcher, there's a temptation to say, well, actually, video games aren't bad for you. They're very good for you. They teach you all these important lessons. They teach you strategic planning and resilience to failure, and they teach you to organize, like, in a group and solve problems. But in a way, that's also perhaps a little too easy, right? That I do think that we should think of video games as a kind of art form, or as a medium, and these things don't just have this kind of very simple kind of good, bad kind of value. So it's not. I think it's just a fact of, like, the relative newness of video games, or at least the relative newness of the discussion of video games, that people wanted to say kind of good, bad. And because, like, I think we are at the point where nobody is actually trying to argue that kind of books are good or books are bad, right? Or music is good or music is bad, or at least it's pretty rare that people do these things. And so I think it's more like perhaps video games should be thought of as a complicated kind of art form that can do all kinds of kind of weird things, but where, like, the how that translates into, you might like say, real life, or to kind of regular action, is kind of complex, right? That it's not something you can predict so entirely linearly as you might want to.
As you said, it seemed to the whole fascination with studying games, at least more recently, seemed to start with worries and moral panics that games were corrupting youth or something. Then it seemed to become very positive, like games can actually teach you a number of skills. Where do you hope that game studies goes after that, and what kind of contributions do you hope it makes? I guess in terms of the debate, obviously becoming more nuanced, or getting away from these simplistic games are good, games are bad. But where do you hope, what kinds of questions do you hope that game studies tackles?
I mean, there is a discussion currently about game culture. I mean, following things like kind of Gamergate, at least I think some people might draw a kind of direct line between kind of how video games are structured and something like conservative backlash in game culture. I think it's a little more complicated in practice, and there's only kind of one thing that's kind of worth kind of considering. One thing I've been working on lately is the question of independent video games. So I'm kind of finishing up a book on that. And to me, that's interesting, because it's, again, a bit like we talked about comparatively just before, that the idea of independent video games is very clearly an import from cinema or music. And to me, it's just been very interesting to think about how an idea like independence actually gets translated, or kind of gets remade in like a digital immaterial medium such as video games. How you can take ideas of something like kind of authenticity, which is often a kind of a concept that's used for kind of independent, say, music or cinema, and then how that actually is translated when people make something that's just kind of entirely made out of bits. And to me, that's just very interesting in a way to see how various cultural ideas are kind of subsumed or kind of remade in video game form. So to me, that's super interesting. In a way, I think in the beginning when we were doing video game studies, we kind of wanted not to do too much kind of comparative work because we wanted to kind of develop our own field. And I think perhaps now it's much less of an issue. So I think it's just always interesting to think about how ideas kind of enter into video games. And right now it's also just very interesting to think about how video games change. And so to me, that's also one of the things that happens is that game studies have been around for sufficiently long that we've made various kind of grand theories about games, and then new games were made sometimes by students who read those theories, and then new works were made which contradicts that. And so I talked about games that are too easy. There are games that are kind of deliberately too easy, like we call them walking simulators sometimes, which are games which are more about just like traversing a landscape and sometimes like hearing a backstory. And so it's very clearly in a way in a video game form, right? You use kind of video game technology and video game conventions apart from the one about failing or being challenged. And that's super interesting too, because then there's this whole question of like, how can that actually work? Like what makes something like this work, even though it's just so different from what we expect a video game to be? And how do people actually react to it? Like, what makes players accept such an experiment, or what makes them reject it? And so, to me, those kind of historical questions are really interesting when they force us to kind of reconsider our theories.
As you said, it's growing to a sort of maturity, game studies, where people don't necessarily have to continue to make arguments of why we should study games. It's kind of accepted now in most circles that game studies is an important and growing and fairly big field right now, especially relative to a few decades ago. How important is it to demarcate, let's say, game studies and game studies scholarship from other things? And I ask, for example, like sometimes I'll go to conferences or whatever, and someone will be talking about a film, and they'll be trying to sort of claim that it's a popular culture studies or a film studies thing. But really what it is it's somebody who studies political science using a film as an example, which is really not to study the art of filmmaking or film studies or contribute to that body of work in any way, really. And so I know that it's sort of a joke among certain people that go to popular culture conferences or film studies. And when you see that person who is saying that they do film studies or effectively saying that, but really they're not, it can be a little annoying for people who have spent a lot of time studying to see someone claim to be doing film studies but clearly has no familiarity whatsoever with any of the film theorists or anything like that. Is it like that with game studies? And how open should it be, in your opinion, versus how sort of regimented should it be?
Oh, yeah, that's also a big question. I think as a matter of principle, like everything is kind of interesting. There's nothing I would say like a priori wouldn't be kind of interesting to see applied to video games. And I would, if I had time, I would like to read all of it. But so I think that's one thing. And then of course you say that there's some more of what might be a kind of social reaction, like what you described, that people get upset if someone comes to what they think of as their field, but not showing any kind of familiarity with it. I don't see that happening that much in games. I think it was more probably the case a lot in the beginning, where there was less of a kind of body of literature, or at least it was less well defined. So you had more people coming in from left field and making some kind of off the cuff kind of big theory of video games without realizing that some of this had been discussed already. I don't see it happening all that much anymore, so it's kind of fairly easy to find some literature now. I guess as a personal thing, I like to see all kinds of things included. It's also, of course, at the same time, it's just interesting to perhaps like dive deep or revisit some of the early scholars, or like, I don't know, Rocher Keiwa or Huizinga, and kind of go back to them. That's also interesting. I guess I'm not actually going to demarcate kind of strongly in any way. I mean, just sometimes it's easy, it's fun to do kind of inside baseball, and sometimes it's interesting to just look much broader and see what other people have. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting way of, I like how you've put that. As a sort of final question, when you say that you want to excise the idea that, it's just a game, is there a way that you would encourage people who might be tempted to say that, or just inherently through common sense values or what have you, be tempted to say, it's just a game, and dismiss games as something that's effectively inconsequential or shouldn't be taken too seriously or whatever? How would you encourage people to think of games if you were to replace that? If you had a sort of magic button that would, anytime someone's about to say, it's just a game, they would actually say something else or consider something else, what might that look like?
One way to put it is that rather than think of games as something that is happening on a screen, think of games as something that's kind of it's a kind of structured human activity, like a kind of ballet. Games are interesting because they make you do things that involve you being actively kind of evaluated, and that just makes them in a way much more kind of real and present than other things such as reading a book or watching a movie.
I love that, and I think it gives people things to think about, whether or not they consider themselves gamers or whether or not they consider themselves part of the field of game studies. I think it's a much broader consideration that you can get from this book, and so I really appreciate you, Jesper, taking the time to speak with me today about this.
Thank you very much. It's been interesting.
I'm deeply thankful to authors such as Jesper Juul for generously giving their time to talk about the work that they're doing and to answer your questions on behalf of me and all of the listeners who are also super important for the sustainability of this podcast. And I want to thank you for listening and contributing in whatever way you have, whether that's sending a good review, ordering some swag from the website, or even ordering some books from the website. We're getting down to the last couple interviews before the end of this season, but I'll be back August with season 3. In the meantime, though, I have a Pulitzer Prize winner, an incredible sociologist, and some interesting stuff coming up before the end of season 2 of This Is Not a Pipe podcast. As always, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.